Welcome to the Cell Membrane series. This video focuses on active transport. At the end of this lecture, students should be able to differentiate between active and passive transport, identify primary and secondary active transport mechanisms, and understand surface area to volume ratios in cells. Transport is moving molecules or solutes across a membrane. Active transport is when we move those molecules against their concentration gradient. Instead of diffusing from high concentration to low concentration, active transport requires energy and moves the solute from low concentration to high concentration areas. The energy we use in active transport is generally in the form of ATP. Primary active transport uses pumps to move the solute across. Secondary transport uses pre-existing gradients to transport the molecules. The image on the left shows a pump actively moving hydrogen ions from a concentration of low solute inside the cell to an area of higher volume in the extracellular fluid. The pump uses ATP by hydrolyzing or breaking off the end phosphate group, releasing a tremendous amount of energy, opening the pump to the outside. In the example on the right, there's a transport protein that moves both hydrogen and sucrose molecules into the cell. The sucrose is moving against its concentration gradient and uses the force of the hydrogen ion buildup from the first pump to drive the mechanism of the second pump. When transport proteins allow only one molecule to cross it, it is called a uniporter. When the transporter allows two molecules, it would either be a symporter, sim meaning same, so transport in the same direction across the membrane, or an antiporter, anti meaning against, so it allows one molecule to go in and the other to go out through the membrane. The sodium-potassium pump is another antiporter. It transfers both ions across the gradient in the opposite direction from low concentration to high concentration. It requires 3 sodium molecules and an ATP to bind inside the cell. As the third phosphate is hydrolyzed, it gives off tremendous energy to open the antiporter, releasing the sodium ions into the extracellular space. Once the 2 potassium ions bind to the protein from the outside of the membrane, an inorganic phosphate binds on the inside. The antiporter closes and the potassium is released into the cell. The sodium-potassium pump is an electrogenic pump since it exports a net positive charge. Our cells undergo metabolism in order to make energy. The electron transport chain is the metabolic process that makes the most ATP. This image is a very simplified version of electron transport, or oxidative phosphorylation, that uses the proton pump and the hydrogen gradient to add the phosphate back onto ADP to make ATP. Another class of proteins are ion channels. Ions are molecules with a charge. They cannot easily cross membranes. One way ions can cross are through voltage gates. These channels are closed, and when the membrane potential is expressed, the gate is open. When the cell is at rest, it is closed. This is how neural synapses transmit information. Another mechanism is a ligand-gated ion channel. These work by requiring a ligand to bond to the channel before it'll change conformation, opening or closing the channel to allow the ions through. Ligands are usually particles used in cell communication, such as neurotransmitters. They bind to receptors, signaling the change. Mechanical changes are changes in conformation. They're due usually to pressure on the inside or the outside of the cell, which causes stress on the membrane. This is usually in regard to movement of fluids with ions mixed in and out to change the pressure on the inside or outside of the cell. Another term for the movement of cellular or extracellular fluid in or out of the cell is osmotic regulation. Each cell has a happy equilibrium state that it wants to maintain. This is known as the cell surface area to volume ratio. As cells grow in response to the environmental fluids, fluids flow in or out of the cell. In addition, they need nutrients to continue to stay healthy and active. They must maintain a specific surface area in order to accommodate their new volume. The issue arises when the flow of fluids is so quick that the surface area cannot keep up. The surface area of the cell, or the membrane, is how the nutrients come in and the waste passes out. If a cell doubles in volume, it needs 8 times the nutrients and creates 8 times the waste. To overcome this, some cells have adapted to change their shape to an elongated or irregular structure. Students should be able to differentiate between active and passive transport. We should be able to describe how ATP pumps work. Students should understand electrochemical gradients and transport ions. Students should be able to identify the difference between primary and secondary active transport mechanisms. And students should be able to indicate why cell size to volume ratio is important.